and then we'll go into the rest of the business here. So I think we're just... Congressman, you're very welcome.
Well, thank you very much for having me here.
This is,
Can this camera, please? Thank you.
thank you. All right,
Well, thank you. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed. Congressman,
Just get one of you looking up.
Oh, yes.
sculpted by an Irish sculptor in Cork.
Yeah.
And it's
beautiful.
located in Dublin City University. So we took it here actually for today.
Like one family. We're a family.
One happy family. That's lovely. Fantastic. Everyone okay?
Yeah, thank you. I'm honored to be here.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, you're very welcome to the first Douglas O'Connell lecture, which will be given this evening by Congressman John Lewis, who needs no introduction to you, I know. He will be introduced presently by An Taoiseach Eamon Gilmore, and after Congressman Lewis gives the lecture, we will then have an open forum in which you are welcome to comment or to ask questions of Congressman Lewis. I would like to ask you, if you're asking a question, to first give us your name, no matter how well known you are to this room, no matter how distinguished. Please just give us your name and rank and title before you ask the question. So could I first invite the Taoiseach, Minister for Foreign Affairs and Leader of the Labour Party, Eamon Gilmore TD, to introduce Congressman Lewis.
Congressman John Lewis, Senator Maisy Hirono, Governor Martin O'Malley, Minister of State Joe Costello, Ministers at the Office of the First Minister and Deputy First Minister Jonathan Bell and Jennifer McCann, Deputies, Senators, Ambassador, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I want to warmly welcome all of you to Iveagh House this evening. We're honoured to have with us Congressman John Lewis of Georgia as our speaker in the Iveagh House Commemorative Lecture Series. I also wish to welcome our other distinguished US visitors, Senator Maisy Hirono and Governor Martin O'Malley, as well as all our United States friends here this evening, as well as representatives of American business in Ireland, whom I'm glad are able to join us for this occasion. There is a special connection between Ireland and the United States in the civil rights area, one long predating the 1960s. I am, of course, referring to that unique relationship between our own great liberator, Daniel O'Connell, and the iconic Frederick Douglass, whose statue you will not have failed to miss, as I'm sure you were on your way into the event here this evening. I'm delighted, therefore, that we are joined this evening by Nettie Washington Douglas, the great-great-granddaughter of Frederick Douglass, and Anne Quinlan, the great-great-granddaughter of Daniel O'Connell, whose relationship Their relationship and friendship today mirrors that of their forebears so many years ago. The relationship between your forebears helped to make history. Such conversations and friendships matter just as much today as we work with our friends in Congress to ensure that US immigration laws facilitate the flow of our young people in both directions and facilitate the exchange of ideas and inspiration that accompanies this. I'm also glad that we are joined by a range of civic and political leaders from Northern Ireland this evening, and in particular I wish to welcome both ministers from the Office of the First Minister and Deputy First Minister, Jonathan Bell, MLA, and Jennifer McCann, MLA. I wish to thank you, John Bowman, for your agreement to moderate the event this evening. Your continuing support to the Iveagh House Commemorative Lecture Series is much appreciated. Congressman John Lewis belongs in the pantheon of great leaders in the American civil rights movement. He holds an honoured place in the great progressive tradition in American history, a tradition that in good days and bad has stood for the rights of working class men and women, for poor and oppressed people, for people without a voice who have been pushed to the edges and margins of society by racial hatred, by bigotry, and by grinding poverty. John Lewis has stood for justice. Edmund Burke, the great Irish parliamentarian and writer, said that whenever a separation is made between liberty and justice, neither is safe. Martin Luther King believed this. Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist leader, believed it and struggled all his life to build a bridge between freedom and justice for African Americans. The civil rights movement in the United States in the 1960s should not be seen through any romantic or soft lens. The century since emancipation and the ending of the Civil War had brought a measure of freedom, but not true freedom, to African Americans. Instead, brutal segregation, pervasive and deep discrimination in employment and in day-to-day life, voting disqualification, and elections rigged through absurd technical requirements such as the so-called literacy test or counting jelly beans in a jar, this was the lot of African Americans as the Second World War ended. Lincoln, more than most, understood the injustice that African Americans would continue to face after emancipation. He understood the original sin of American slavery. His second inaugural address, only a few weeks before his assassination, assessed this with unflinching moral clarity. Humiliation and degradation was the daily lot of African Americans when Martin Luther King, John Lewis, and other civil rights leaders in the early 1960s said this was a moral stain and set out to challenge the conscience of America. Known as the Freedom Riders, they highlighted the evil of segregation in public transport and captured the imagination of the world. Many hundreds, including John Lewis, were arrested and jailed in Mississippi during the Freedom Rides. But they helped to bring an end to segregation in public transport. Across the South, courageous men and women demanded their rights. The civil rights movement in the United States did not have easy victories. The March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom in August 1963 and Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech are now part of the story of America. But the struggle was harsh and difficult. In March 1965, John Lewis with Hosea Williams led 600 peaceful protesters across Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma in what was intended to be a march from Selma to Montgomery. The scenes of violence and brutality against the marchers by Alabama state troopers shocked America and the world and helped hasten passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This year we mark the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act. In so doing, we honour the leaders of the civil rights movement for their courage and commitment, even if, as Congressman Lewis has often reminded us, the journey remains far from finished. A few weeks ago, President Obama launched the My Brother's Keeper initiative in support of boys and young men of colour. Congressman Lewis has noted realities that should give us pause. Young African American men and boys, for example, are six times more likely to be victims of gun violence than white boys. In the state of Georgia, only 49% of African boys graduated from high school compared to 65% of white boys. Too many African American young men waste their best years in prison. The work of building justice goes on. John Lewis has lived a long journey from Parchman Penitentiary to Bloody Sunday in Selma to become a congressional and political leader of great authority and moral weight. The civil rights movement in America had worldwide resonance, not least in Northern Ireland. It inspired young activists in the North to peacefully demand justice and change, confident in their conviction that injustice against one group in society cannot continue without endangering the entire fabric of society itself. Civil rights protesters in the late 1960s in Northern Ireland were inspired by and identified themselves with the US civil rights movement and the struggle of African Americans. They sang "We Shall Overcome," they modelled their protest marchers on the Selma Montgomery March, and they based their strategy on the American civil rights movement strategy. Many of the issues were the same: employment discrimination, housing, the grievance of being second-class citizens that had built up over many years. Above all, the civil rights leaders in the North, our Nobel Peace Laureate John Hume, chief amongst them, based their campaign on the same fundamental principle of non-violence and was the hallmark of the civil rights movement in America. Overcoming bitterness and division requires more than placing laws on the statute book. It means overcoming, in Alan Patton's words, the fear of bondage and the bondage of fear. We in Ireland are still embarked on a journey to overcome division and to achieve reconciliation, tolerance and mutual trust, and to the protection and vindication of the human rights of all. The state visit by President Higgins to the UK 2 weeks ago was an important milestone in that journey. In 1876, Frederick Douglass, once a fugitive slave himself, spoke at the opening of the Freemen's Monument to Abraham Lincoln in Washington. In a measured and deeply honest appraisal of the war years, he said of Abraham Lincoln, "He did not hesitate, he did not doubt, he did not falter." Neither did Martin Luther King, John Lewis, nor the leaders of the civil rights movement. We too must bear this in mind as we work to heal divisions on our own island. In perhaps his greatest speech, Robert F. Kennedy addressed students in Cape Town, South Africa in June 1966 and spoke of his belief that ripples of hope spread each time a person stands up for an ideal or acts to improve the lot of others or strikes out against injustice. Together, Senator Kennedy said, these individual ripples of hope can help build a current which can sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression and resistance. Martin Luther King also believed this. His dream, as Congressman Lewis said last year on the anniversary of the March on Washington, was a nation and a world at peace with itself. Dr. King opposed the Vietnam War, although some in the civil rights movement at the time urged caution and compromise. But Dr. King did not believe the cause of justice could be separated neatly into different moral compartments. Douglass, Lincoln, King, Kennedy and Hume were all torchbearers for the cause of liberty and justice for all, irrespective of rank, race or creed. John Lewis is of this pantheon. John Lewis has devoted his life to extending the meaning and practice of freedom. From his work as chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee to the halls of Congress, he has kept an unwavering eye on the prize. And this evening I want to thank Congressman Lewis for the support given by the United States Congress to the work of reconciliation in Ireland, for its unwavering political support and for its long-standing practical support through the International Fund for Ireland. In the prologue to his wonderful biography, Walking with the Wind, a memoir of the movement, Congressman Lewis recounts a story from his childhood when his family and friends were forced to take shelter from a storm whose ferocity was such that it threatened to lift their wood frame home from the ground. Together they held their hands and, moving from one part of the house to the other, succeeded in preventing the trembling house from lifting. It is a story which has echoed throughout his life. Allow me then to introduce him with his own words. Children holding hands, walking with the wind. That is America to me, not just the movement for civil rights, but the endless struggle to respond with decency, dignity, and a sense of brotherhood to all the challenges that face us, a nation as a whole. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Congressman John Lewis.
Thank you so much for those kind words of introduction. I don't have much time, so I don't want to take time in recognizing everybody because everybody has been introduced. So all of the honorable elected and appointed officials and all of the American delegation, thank you. I want to thank you for inviting me to be here. Thank you for those kind words. I feel more than lucky, but very blessed to be here. It is a great pleasure for me to stand here tonight to honor two champions of peace who struggled and suffered not just for a people, but for one nation, but for the liberation of humankind. Frederick Douglass and Daniel O'Connor lived almost 2 centuries ago, but their examples still light up the minds of people today. What is it about what they gave and what they sacrificed that made their legacy one we still honor and praise down through the ages? After the events of March 7, 1965 in America, what we call Bloody Sunday, named after a conflict here in Ireland in 1887 between police and protesters. President Lyndon Johnson made one of the most powerful statements any American president had made about the quest for freedom and the issue of justice in the United States. He said that night, "I speak tonight for the dignity of man and the destiny of democracy." He went on to say, "At time, history and fate meet in a single place and a single time in man's unending search for freedom." He continued by saying, "Our mission is at once the oldest and the most basic of this country, to right and wrong, to do justice, to serve man. In our time, we have come to live the moments of great crisis. Our lives have been marked with debate about great issues, issues of war and peace, issue of prosperity and depression. But rarely in any time, does an issue lay bare the secret heart of a nation itself. The issue of equal rights for every human being is such an issue. And should we defeat every enemy, and should we double our wealth and conquer the stars and still be unequal to this issue, then we have failed as a people and as a nation." He went on to say, "What does it a nation profit if it shall gain the whole world and lose its own soul?" At the end of the speech, President Johnson used the words of the theme song of the Civil Rights Movement. Became the first American president to say, "And we shall overcome." With these words, a man you may feel is an unlikely prophet sum up the entire course of recorded history. The search for freedom is the core of every conflict. The search for freedom is the core of every conflict. It is the foundation of every great nation. The search for freedom is written on the heart of every man. It calls from the depth of every woman's soul. It is captured by the poetic innocence that filled the mouths of babes. It is a divine right that can never be taken away, no matter what king or queen or president, corporate, joint, multinational power may do. No matter what politics or evil scheme may be devised, it can be delayed, but it will never be denied. The thirst, the hunger for freedom is old as the dawn of history and as fresh as the morning dew. And tonight, my beloved friends, And that is why the lives of Daniel O'Connor and Frederick Douglass remain so relevant today. Because we are still on that journey down a long road toward the liberation of humankind. That's why the work of individuals in America, like Cesar Chavez, or Betty Williams here, Nelson Mandela, leave lessons for all of us that are meaningful today. We are still on the journey begun thousands of years ago, a march toward justice to redeem the soul of every nation and free and liberate people from slavery, from hunger, from war and violence. In the final analysis, these two men said in their own way, we're one people, one family, the human family. They were saying we all live in one house, the same house, the world house, not just the house of America, but the house of Ireland. O'Connor and Douglass, I believe, and I may be wrong, only met once. Am I right? But their meeting was transformative. You share that with me? Am I right? Historians saying yes? It was 1845, about 7 years after Douglass. He ran away from a Maryland plantation with hellhounds barking at his heel to declare himself a free man in the North. This Emerald Isle, this beautiful place, this beautiful land you call Ireland, so green, so beautiful, was his refuge. He traveled throughout these beautiful shores to finally sell his fate as a free man. About his visit to Dublin, he said, I find myself not to be treated as a color. I find myself not treated as a color, but as a man, not as a thing, but as a child of the common Father of us all. That is powerful. For a runaway slave to come across the ocean and say, I find myself not treated as a color, but as a man, not as a thing, but as a child of the common Father of us all. We don't speak that way today. We don't write that way today. Daniel O'Connor and other Irishmen have been early advocates against the trafficking of slaves. So O'Connor never traveled to America and may never have seen the brutality of American slavery. Somehow he saw a connection between his struggle and their struggle. Somehow he realized that they were all oppressed by the same hand, and that all humankind were in the same boat. Douglass felt the same connection. He saw the suffering of Irish citizens who were left out and left behind. And through that suffering, he discovered an immutable bond that joined him to all of the human suffering everywhere. So when he heard O'Connor speak so powerful and so passionately about the freedom of slavery, about men and women he had never met, he was transformed. He became convinced that the struggle for liberation was one struggle, a worldwide struggle, to free all humanity from the vile hand of oppression. And it was also Donald O'Connor who convinced Douglass that nonviolence, that the way of peace, the way of peaceful coexistence, was a more excellent way to meet their common enemy. The longer I live, I've come to believe that nonviolence is one of those most immutable principles that should never be violated. It is the natural companion of the highest value of love, peace, and compassion. And it seemed that the message constantly put before us as the key to our ultimate freedom. 25 years later, it's something I believe in really, called the spirit of history. I know some political scientists, some historians, some philosophers, some theologians may disagree with me. But I believe in something called the spirit of history. So almost 25 years, when Frederick Douglass was still alive in another corner of the world, another man was born into the same struggle against the same human foe. Gandhi was born in 1869. And the work of Gandhi will go on to impact the life of Martin Luther King Jr. and hundreds and thousands of millions of citizens in America and around the world. The work of Dr. King, the inspiration of Gandhi, and Douglass and others make it possible for me to stand here today. And I would dare say if it hadn't been for Frederick Douglass, hadn't been for a Gandhi, or Martin Luther King, or Daniel O'Connor, preaching the way of peace, the way of love, peaceful coexistence, there would be no Barack Obama as President of the United States today if you believe in the spirit of history. You see, there is a spirit of struggle passed down through the ages, and everyone who is a part of it come to this planet with the same purpose, to share one great truth about the sisterhood and the brotherhood of all humankind. Dr. King put it one way when he said, we must learn to live together as brothers and sisters, or we will perish as fools. Gandhi put it another way. It is either non-violence or non-existent. Now, some of you heard me say earlier today, I grew up on a farm in rural Alabama, about 50 miles from Montgomery. When I would go downtown with my father, my mother, my grandparents, my great-grandparents, and I would see those signs that said white women, colored women, white men, colored women, white waiting, colored waiting. I used to ask my mother, my father, my grandparents, and great-grandparents, why segregation? Why racial discrimination? And they would say, that's the way it is. Don't get in the way, don't get in trouble. But the action of Rosa Parks, the teaching of Martin Luther King Jr., inspired me to get in trouble. Good trouble, necessary trouble. I tell you, when you read the story of O'Connell and Douglass, I'm inspired to continue to get in trouble. To continue to stand up and speak up and speak out. In the civil rights movement, as many of you know, we just didn't wake up one day and decide to march on Washington, or march from Selma to Montgomery, or go on a freedom ride. We studied what Gandhi attempted to do in South Africa, what he accomplished in India. We studied what Dr. King was all about in Montgomery. We studied Thoreau and civil disobedience, and we were ready. And the sit-ins spread all across the South like Bermuda grass or like a wildfire. There are very few people who will ever question the philosophy of peace, the philosophy of love, the way of nonviolence, a more excellent way. They may call it brilliant, beautiful, and right, but in their hearts, most people doubt whether peace can really work. But let me tell you a story about Bloody Sunday, March 7, 1965, when you heard reference to a few moments ago. On March 7, 1965, 600 of us, innocent young children, men and women, at the church, decided to walk in an orderly fashion. I was wearing a backpack before it became fashionable to wear backpacks. And in this backpack, I had 2 books. I thought we were going to be arrested and go to jail. I wanted to have something to read. Had 1 apple and 1 orange. I wanted to have something to eat while I was in jail. That wouldn't last too long. Had toothpaste and a toothbrush. I wanted to be able to brush my teeth. Orderly, peacefully. In Selma, Alabama, people could not register to vote simply because of the color of their skin. People were asked to count the number of bubbles in a bar of soap, the number of jelly beans in a jar. People stood in unmovable line. There was teachers, lawyers, doctors, ministers being told over and over again that they couldn't pass the literacy test. So we had to do something. So we set out to march. We got to the highest point on that Pettis Bridge. We looked down below, we saw a sea of blue, Alabama State Troopers, and we continued to walk. A man spoke up and said, "I'm Major John Cloud of the Alabama State Troopers. This is unlawful march. It will not be allowed to continue. I give you 3 minutes to disperse and return to your church." And one of the leaders of the march walking beside me said, "Major, give us a moment to kneel and pray." And the major said, "Troopers, advance." You saw these men putting on their gas masks. They came toward us, beating us with nightsticks, bullwhips, trampling us with horses, and releasing the tear gas. 17 of us were hurt and hospitalized. Had a concussion there on the bridge. Thought I saw death. I thought I was going to die. Because of what happened in Selma on Bloody Sunday, there was a sense of righteous indignation all across America. By the following Tuesday, there were nonviolent protests in more than 80 cities, almost every major college and university campus, at the White House, at the Department of Justice. And President Johnson spoke to the nation 8 days later. 8 days later, he spoke. Introduced the Voting Rights Act. The Congress debated the act. We finally marched. 2 weeks later, rather than 600, more than 30,000 Americans, black and white, Latino, Asian American, and Native American. The act was signed into law, and because of that law, there have been changes in America. Been what I call a nonviolent revolution. A revolution of values, a revolution of ideas. If it hadn't been for the Voting Rights Act of 1965, I wouldn't be standing here as a member of the House of Representatives. So we can bring about change through peaceful, non-violent action. It took years of nonviolent protests, but I tell you today, America is a different America. We are a better people. Our country is a better country. Just a few months ago, to be exact, Faith in Politics, so many representatives are here today, led a trip that we've been doing for the past 15 years to Alabama. We arrived in the city of Montgomery, the city where I first met Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. when I was 18 in 1958. Went to a church called the First Baptist Church. the pastor of that church, is here today. You can raise your hand, brother. Don't be. I know this is not typical of a lecture. Thank you. The point I want to make, not only does laws change and create different situations, but when we arrived at that church, a young police officer, who is also here today from Montgomery. He's young, he's white. He was not even born in 1961. He was not even a dream in 1961. When we arrived there during the Freedom Ride, an angry mob beat us and left us bloody. Some of us unconscious, some of us in a pool of blood. They stood by. Some of us were hospitalized. Some of us almost died. This young chief, not playing, we didn't know anything about it, came to the church and spoke and said, in effect, Congressman, when you came here in 1961, the same year that President Obama was born, he said, our police department was not kind to you. But we have a better police department today. Before anyone can become a member of this police department, they must know something about Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King Jr., know what happened in Montgomery, in Selma, in Birmingham. And he continued to talk. And then before he finished, he said in his own word, he can say it better than I can. He said, I want to show my appreciation and my respect for what you all did. I'm going to take off my badge. I'm going to give you my badge. And this young deputy is sitting down front, young African American, just lost, they start crying. And I started crying. And I said, Chief, you can't give me your badge. You're the chief of police. You need your badge. And he said, I can get another one. Kevin Murphy, Chief of Police of Montgomery, Alabama, why don't you stand? He apologized to what happened. You talk about reconciliation, you talk about laying down the burden of separation, laying down the burden of division, and building a community. For it is true, in a final analysis, we are one people, one family, one house. Not just the house of Ireland or America, but the world house. I said earlier today, I did get arrested a few times during the 60s. Almost died. But I'm not bitter, I'm not hostile. On another occasion, in 1961, in another state, another town, a young member of the Klan attacked us after we got off a bus. My seatmate, a young white gentleman, tried to enter a so-called white waiting room, beat us and left us bloody and unconscious. But many years later, the same young man, much not young anymore, older than I am, came to my office in Washington. He was so moved by the election of President Obama. His son had been encouraging his father to find a way to seek out the people that he had wronged. He said, Congressman Lewis, I'm one of the people that beat you. Will you forgive me? I'm sorry. I want to apologize. I said, I accept your apology. His son started crying, he started crying, I started crying. We hugged. called me brother, and I called him brother. Is it possible for us to lay down the burden of division, become one large family, part of humanity, and redeem not just the soul of our nation, but redeem the soul of our planet? That is our calling. That is our mission. And in this process, whether you're in government, foundation, in education, business, we must take the long, hard look and never, ever give up or give in or get lost in a sea of despair. We must keep the faith and be prepared for the long march. Thank you in the name of O'Connor and Douglas.
Congressman Lewis. I'm now going to invite first Michael Farrell to respond. Michael was a leader of the People's Democracy in 1968 in Queen's University in Belfast, formed a political party, was leader of the march, one of the leaders of the March to Burntollett, was later considered dangerous enough to be interned during Brian Faulkner's period as First Minister in Northern Ireland, and he has since been a historian, a lawyer, and for 10 years a member of the Human Rights Commission. Michael.
I must say I am delighted and honoured to have the opportunity to say a few words in welcome and tribute to Congressman John Lewis. The Taoiseach has said earlier, has mentioned the influence the civil rights movement in the United States had on the civil rights movement in Northern Ireland. I'm one of a generation that grew up in Northern Ireland with the images of that struggle shown on Pathé newsreels in the cinemas at a time before we had television sets. I remember when I was a 13-year-old seeing film about the Little Rock Nine, the first black students to enter the Central High School in Little Rock in Arkansas, and the abuse that they were subjected to. When I started my first year at Queen's University, Belfast, the same year that it took a small army of US federal marshals to enable James Meredith to become the first black student to enter the University of Mississippi. That made a deep impression on me and on many people in Northern Ireland. The appalling injustice that we could see on our screens, combined with the tactics and strategy of the US civil rights movement, provided both the inspiration and the example for people who were concerned about discrimination and injustice in Northern Ireland, at a time when there seemed to be no prospect of change being achieved through the unresponsive Parliament at Stormont, local Parliament at Stormont, or through an uncaring government in Westminster. The Northern Ireland movement took its name, its tactics, and even the songs that it sang on marches from the US movement. And we were all very influenced by this. Many of us would have seen in 1963, this time on television, we would have seen the March in Washington and been inspired by the soaring rhetoric of Dr. Martin Luther King on that day. But those of us who were students at the time were also impressed by a fiery young student leader who also spoke at the March in Washington and is the last surviving speaker of that group who spoke then on that day. That's Congressman Lewis, then chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. And 2 years later, we saw John Lewis again on the TV screens as he led the protest march that he's talked about that attempted to go from Selma to the state capital, Montgomery, in his home state of Alabama. And they were beaten and gassed off the road by state troopers. But within a few weeks of that march and of what happened to them, a much larger crowd was able to walk the road to Montgomery And a few months later, the Voting Rights Act was signed into law by President Kennedy. So their sacrifice and the suffering that they had on that march had its result. 4 years later, a student civil rights march set out from Belfast to Derry, modelled directly on the Selma Montgomery March, called itself a civil rights and anti-poverty march, as the American movement was beginning to do, only to be attacked at Burnpollet Bridge. I was one of the people involved in that. And that's how great and how close the influence of the United States movement was on the civil rights movement in Northern Ireland. And I suppose I've waited for 45 years for the opportunity to say thank you to Congressman Lewis for his inspiration and example. Now, sadly, for many and complex reasons, which it's not appropriate to go into tonight, but things took a very different turn in Northern Ireland, leading to 30 years of conflict and war, to tremendous suffering and deaths, and loss both of lives and of limbs, and of people's lives, people who spent hundreds of years in jail, collectively thousands of years in jail, I suppose, as a result of the conflict. But happily, thankfully, a great deal of progress has been made in recent years with the peace process. But I think that there too, the example of Congressman Lewis can still teach us some useful lessons 50 years on from that time in America. He has not given up the struggle. He has, in an America where the divide between rich and poor is wider than ever, and where there are persistent attempts to undermine the gains that were made by the civil rights movement in terms of affirmative action and similar methods, he has persistently said that there is still work to be done, and he has worked hard to inspire and empower the poor and the marginalised to continue to struggle for their rights. And that has a relevance to us too. It's particularly relevant, I think, in Northern Ireland today, because while the peace process has had tremendous success, and we have reached a point where violence is almost eliminated, and where certainly there is no one who can put forward a coherent argument for the use of violence today in Northern Ireland. But on the other hand, the expected peace dividend has not trickled down to everyone. And as a result of that, you have disaffection, you have anger and frustration in parts of the community. And if that is not dealt with, there is the danger that it will bubble up again into violence and will undo a lot of the good that has been done in the last number of years. So we can learn from, and Congressman Lewis has moved from the days of marches in the streets to working in the City Council in Atlanta first, now in Congress, working all the time for the good of ordinary people. He's been called the conscience of Congress because he has stood out against his own party on a number of occasions, opposing the war in Iraq and working for the poor, opposing cutbacks in welfare and so on in the United States, even when it is done by democratic administrations. Because we still have these problems. The poor, it says in the Bible, we will always have with us. I don't agree that we should always have or accept that we will always have the poor with us, but we do have the poor with us, and we have had, and we will continue for quite some time to have the poor with us, and we must work for the poor. That's what it's all about. The campaign for equality in the civil rights movement should be equality too between ordinary people, and should, in a country where the divide gets greater, and it's in all our countries, the divide gets greater between rich and poor, that's what we should be working to end. The struggle for human rights is ever-changing as well. There are other issues on the table now. So, for instance, in our country, we have issues of racism, which were not the issue in the past. In the United States, you have issues of illegal immigrants. You have issues of the erosion of civil rights and human rights in the war on terror. And we also have rights that we hadn't thought of in the past. In the early days of the civil rights movement, the rights of women were hardly thought about, we in the leadership of the movement were probably as chauvinist as anybody else. But now we know that women's rights have to be fought for. We know that the rights of gay people and lesbians and transgender people have to be fought for. So that struggle continues. And I think Congressman Lewis has shown us by his longevity in the struggle. Martin Luther King spoke in his famous last speech about longevity. Congressman Lewis has been long in this struggle, 60 years almost. But he has carried on. He has kept the faith. He has continued the struggle. And I'd like to thank him for coming here to share with us his experience, his commitment, his inspiration. And I hope that that can be of some benefit to us in attempting to move further in solving the troubles and the problems of Northern Ireland, and in also solving the problems in this part of the country where people are suffering as a result of cutbacks, suffering as a result of the work of the instructions of the Troika, of the results of the economic boom and bust that we had. So the struggle will continue all the time. He has kept the faith. It is a lesson to us to keep the faith as well and carry on the struggle. Thank you.
I always take the view that individual political systems are best understood as discrete and not necessarily to be always compared and contrasted. So I'd like to thank Michael very much for capturing exactly what happened in Northern Ireland in 1968 relative to picking up on the movement and the values and the anthems and the choreography and the tactics of the American civil rights movement. I think he captured it extremely well. Thank you, Michael. The meeting is now open to the floor. I accept questions or contributions as a response. And if you could give us your name. And there's a microphone, 2 microphones on either side. So if you covet the microphone that is not in use, I'll call you in all the sooner. Yes.
I'm probably showing a lack of knowledge of recent American history, but I'd like to ask Congressman this
Paul,
question.
tell us your name. Yeah.
Sorry, Paul Coughlin, Shanadair. Senator or former President Lyndon Johnson was quoted very favourably, and it was wonderful to hear your quotations from him. But do you think, as a Texan and a Southerner, that was he simply following in the footsteps and a path laid down by Kennedy, or was he genuine in the words he employed in how they portrayed him? You know, we have heard so much over the years, or no, I shouldn't say so much, but something of him politically as a Machiavellian type man, perhaps. I don't want to wrong him, but I would be interested in your comments on him. Thank you very much.
And stay seated. Michael will catch you.
Thank you. I think President Johnson was real. I think he was sincere. I think he was committed. After the assassination of President Kennedy, I think he felt that he had an obligation, a mission, and mandate to get the civil rights legislation passed almost as a living testimony to President Kennedy. When we met with him, he said, we're going to do it. And he did it. Lyndon Johnson, very smart. He knew where all of the bodies lied in Washington. He knew everybody. And you know, he was very tall and sizable, and he can put those big hands on you, arms around your shoulder, and he would call people in and tell them, I'm going to do it, and don't get in my way. I remember after the Civil Rights Act was passed and signed into law on July 2nd, 1964, and after he won the election and Dr. King received the Nobel Peace Prize, he came back to America from Europe, Dr. King did, had a meeting with President Johnson, and said, Mr. President, we need a strong voting rights act. And President Johnson said in so many words, Dr. King, I just signed a Civil Rights Act. We don't have the votes in Congress to get a voting rights act passed. And he went on and said, why don't you make me do it? And Selma created the climate, created the environment for Lyndon Johnson to get it done. I think he was for real.
And he had the skills to get it done.
He had the skill. He had the skill, the know-how. He knew the buttons to push, and he knew how to make deals and trades. If you need that bridge, or you want that reservoir, if you want, we'll get it done, but you got to vote for this bill.
Thank you, Paul, for that question.
Congressman Lewis, can you talk about the years after 64 to 65, after the Voting Rights Act passed, after the Civil Rights Act passed? There's a sense in history that these were magic wands that instantly cured things. Maybe like in Northern Ireland, people think that the 98
No, we had work to do. We had hard work to do, had nitty-gritty work to do, to go out there and convince people that you have the Voting Rights Act. You got to get out there. That's what Lyndon Johnson told us. On the morning he signed the Voting Rights Act, he signed it on August 6, 1965. A small group of us met with him before he signed it. He said, you got to go back and get people registered. There was a lot of fear. People were afraid that their homes would be bombed. They lose their jobs. They'd be put off the farms, their plantation. So people did the work. But in a matter of a short time, people started registering, they started voting, and some of the bad characters got kicked out of office. A sheriff here, a mayor here, and some others. They were no longer around. And if it hadn't been for the Voting Rights Act, I wouldn't be sitting here as a member of Congress. And many other black and white elected officials, and Latino elected officials, and Asian American elected officials, we would be in places where we are today. The Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act changed America forever. Those signs came tumbling down. And I tell young people, I tell children, those signs are gone and they will not return. The only places they will see those signs today will be in a book, in a museum, or on a video.
Microphone is coming.
Siobhan Mullally from University College Cork and a member of the Irish Human Rights Commission. Thank you, Congressman Lewis. I just wanted to ask you, what do you think will be the most important legacy of the Obama administration for civil rights in America today? And secondly, if I can ask a second question, Taoiseach has said that marriage equality...
I'll come back to you for the second question.
Okay.
We take the first question first.
Well, I don't want to be flip about it, anything like, but I think the very election, of Barack Obama as President of the United States, I tell you, it changed everything. To see a man of color in the White House, it moved our country, our society, and I think it helped move the world community miles and miles down that long road. It's more than a down payment.
And your second question?
Thank you. Our Taoiseach has said that marriage equality, same-sex marriage, is the civil rights issue of this generation. I was wondering if you would comment on that.
Well, I said to a small group of young people today, the governor was there and the senator was there, a group of students, high school and college students, that years ago in America, people had some question or some issue about interracial marriage during the 50s. And people asked Martin Luther King Jr. about interracial marriage. You know, we had laws in America, especially part of the Constitution of certain states, that black people and white people couldn't get married. And people asked Martin Luther King, he would say, races don't fall in love and get married. Individuals fall in love and get married. So when people come along and ask about same-sex marriage, my simple response is, I fought too long and too hard against discrimination based on race and color, not to be against discrimination based on sexual orientation. You cannot have equality for some and not for all. And in America, I'm somewhat surprised as how far we have come in such a short time. I think in a matter of a few years, we're going to look back and say, why were we so silly? What was all the fuss about?
Yes, here. Hi, Congressman. My name's Jeff Castleton. I'm a managing director for Amazon here in Dublin. First of all, thanks for being here tonight. I spent the better half of my career in university studying the work that you did and others as part of the civil rights movement, so it's a real pleasure to be here. A lot of what you've said tonight resonates with me. I've been here in Ireland for about the last 6 years, and it's been interesting to watch the US from afar. And I was pretty shocked, actually, when President Obama was elected, happy at the same time. I'd like to hear your comments, though, on what do you think about the sort of dismantling, almost, that you see of the Voting Rights Act in recent elections? There's been a lot of disenfranchisement that's came about. And just the other day, I believe there was a Supreme Court ruling as well that striking down affirmative action a little bit more. I like what you just said in the response to this last question here, that we'll look back on ourselves and be silly, but at the same time, there's a little bit of fear in my own mind that maybe we're regressing a bit.
Well, I'm deeply concerned about the action of the present Supreme Court. During another period in recent American history, we tended to look at the federal court, and especially the Supreme Court, as a sympathetic referee in the whole struggle for civil rights. I was in the courtroom the day when the hearing took place on the voting rights side. And last June, when that decision came down, I felt like crying, but I wouldn't cry. But it said to me, you got to fight much harder and maybe a little longer to protect voting rights. In America, or in a democratic society, such as America, the vote is precious, almost sacred. It is the most powerful, nonviolent instrument or tool we have in a democratic society. And it should be easy and simple for someone to register or to cast a vote. And I continue to say to my colleagues in the Congress and to others, we come too far, we made too much progress. We cannot go back, we got to go forward. We're going to fix it. We have a bill pending in the House now. We just need to bring it to the floor and pass it. And we're going to do it. So don't be weary. Don't get lost in the sea of despair. It's going to work out. But the struggle for civil rights, the struggle to bring about change is not a struggle that lasts for a few days, a few weeks, a few months, a few years, or a lifetime, maybe many lifetimes, but we got to continue to struggle. That's the beauty of it.
Question here, front row.
Thank you. Joe McHugh from Donegal. I feel I have to ask you a question because I'm sitting quite close to you. So
that's okay. Feel free.
But, Congressman, thank you very, very much for your all-inspiring contribution, and I listened to you earlier as well, and I know you made reference to immigration reform up in the Phoenix Park. I spoke to your colleague, Kevin Brady, in September, and he said it's difficult, but it's doable. So my question, I suppose, is to yourself, how difficult is it? And it's probably two parts. Is it achievable? Is it doable? So how difficult is it?
Well, you know, it's achievable, and we should do it. I don't want to, you know, I'm in Ireland, far from the floor of the House, and I don't want to get in trouble, but if I get in trouble, it'll be good trouble. It'll be necessary trouble. But
get arrested.
I got arrested around comprehensive immigration reform with 7 other members of Congress and 200 American citizens. That was my last arrest. But what we need is what I call courage, raw courage. And I don't know, I'm not sure about here, but sometimes I run into people, elected and would-be elected officials, who love the world, but they really don't like people. Now, if we really like people, we would free and liberate hundreds and thousands of people, especially children and young people, who live in constant fear all over America. That something's going to happen to them. They're going to be deported. I'm for comprehensive immigration. I'm for setting people on a path to citizenship. If we fail to do it, I don't think history will be kind to us. It's going to happen. It must happen. But it's maybe hopeful before the general election, maybe after the primary season is over. But if we have the courage to bring it to the floor of the House, the Senate did it, right, Senator? We could pass it. We could pass it next Monday or Tuesday. Just bring it. We'll get enough votes to do it.
There are two more questions, and then I'll call on Nettie Douglas to conclude. Just here. Just here.
Thank you. Catherine Zappone, American Irish. Thank you for your extraordinary speech this evening, Congressman. And your words, your discourse was filled with religious or spiritual or ethical language. So I'm just wondering if you might be willing to comment a little bit more about maybe the role of religion or the spirit in your work for civil rights, in your own work for civil rights, and then maybe the role of that in the wider work for civil rights in general.
Well, faith, you know, the group is Faith and Politics Institute. Faith played a major role. Religion played a major role in the civil rights movement. After Bloody Sunday in Selma on March 7, 1965, while some of us were still in the hospital, was a group of nuns at a little hospital called the Good Samaritan Hospital. A group of nuns who were so brave and so courageous, they took care of us. In a few days, they all retired now, those that are still around. They retired and living in Rochester, New York. I'm going to go there and visit them and thank them. There was a priest, a Catholic priest, who was from Connecticut, named Olette, Father Maurice Olette, in charge of a mission, a little mission there, that served the African American community in Selma. He literally ran out. But in recent years, he moved back to Selma. The pastor here of First Baptist Church would tell you that if it hadn't been for the churches, for the religious community, we wouldn't be where we are today. 2 days after Bloody Sunday, Martin Luther King Jr. issued a call for religious leaders to come to Selma. And more than 1,000 priests, rabbis, nuns, and ministers came on Tuesday, March 9th, and marched to the same point where we had been beaten 2 days earlier. Hadn't been for organized religion, for the churches, for these committed individuals, we wouldn't be where we are today. Many of the meetings, the 3 civil rights workers that was killed in June of 1964 were on their way to investigate the burning of an African American church. Many of the mass meetings, most of the mass meetings and rallies were held in churches. It was our meeting place. So my faith kept me here. I don't want to be too religious about it, but I believe there was some people praying for me who almost died on that bridge.
Yes, question here.
Thank you. Michael O'Flaherty from the Irish Centre for Human Rights at the National University of Ireland in Galway. You spoke, Congressman, earlier about the transformative effect of the civil rights legislation in the United States. I'd like to ask you to elaborate a little bit on that in the context of the Northern Ireland situation, where, as you may know, one of the unfinished pieces of the peace agreement is the adoption of a Bill of Rights for Northern Ireland. How might a Bill of Rights help contribute to the final stages, or those ultimate transformative stages of the Irish peace process?
Well, I think a Bill of Rights can help create the framework, the climate, the environment, to bring about lasting peace and order and tranquility for generations yet to come.
You're not volunteering now to chair the talks, to deliver it.
No. But we have to use different means and methods to get to where we want to go. Create the climate, create the environment. Keep talking. Never give up. Keep meeting. I want to go back to, I think Michael made the point about Ole Miss. That's where President Kennedy had to call out troopers. In a few days, I'm going to go to Ole Miss. They invited me to come and deliver the commencement address. And they're going to give me an honorary degree. That would have been unheard of. You heard of Parchment State Penitentiary? It's one of the worst penitentiaries in America. That's where almost 400 of us went during the Freedom Ride. There were priests, rabbis, ministers, teachers, college professors that came from all across the country because black people and white people were testing segregation at bus stations and train stations and airports in Jackson, Mississippi in 1961. And you go back there today, in 1961 in the state of Mississippi, 63, 64, 65, the black voting age population was more than 450,000, and only about 16,000 blacks were registered to vote. But today, the state of Mississippi has the highest number of black elected officials than any state because of the Voting Rights Act and the climate, the environment.
I'm going to call on Nettie Washington Douglas to say a few final words.
Thank you. Hasn't this been a most amazing time spent? What a wonderful way to spend an evening. And I thank you. Congressman Lewis, you've traveled nearly 4,000 miles only to hear the following words of gratitude from one of your own constituents. And also a native Alabamian. Gotta throw that in. On behalf of the Frederick Douglass family and the Frederick Douglass Daniel O'Connell Project, I want to thank you for all that you have done throughout your venerable career to agitate for change. What tremendous strength it must take to wake up day after day, and as Frederick Douglass would say, demand that power concede on behalf of those who can't. This is what you have done, not just for me, but for all of us in this room. Because so much of what you have accomplished reminds us of the work of Frederick Douglass, we want to present you with this token, it's undercover, in his image at the age he was when he arrived in Ireland. We hope that it will remind you of this night, and in words written for this occasion from another Douglas O'Connell Project Advisor Committee member, the writer Colum McCain, that, quote, "No story is one story. We are built on the architecture of many others, and this statue of Frederick Douglass is so much more than a thing to be sculpted from bronze. What it means is that our stories are endless and ongoing. No history is final. Human endeavor refuses to pack itself up in a series of neat simplicities. We are braided together. It is up to us to sculpt a future from memory. We reach into the past to understand where we might eventually be tomorrow." Congressman Lewis, thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.